Is this Canon 450D still relevant in 2022? Today I'm going to try to find that out. The Canon 450D was launched back in 2008, and this was in the very early days of the DSLRs. Things were still pretty basic. There was no video function, there was no live view function. So this is kind of a basic camera, but it's still a DSLR camera and you can still do amazing things with it, in my opinion. This camera has only 12.2 megapixels, but that should be enough megapixels for basically anything that you do. You really rarely need any more than 12 megapixels. It has only 9 autofocus points, with only the center point being a cross type point. I will get back to the autofocus later in the video. To start things off, this camera is basically free. I got this camera along with a lens that I bought, and I'm pretty sure it didn't really add to the cost of the package. You can get these on the used market for almost nothing these days. And considering how great these cameras were back in the day, I think you might strike a really good deal on the used market on one of these, especially if you just want to try out the DSLR or you just want to try out photography in general. I used to use this camera back in the days. I remember being 17, 18 years old and getting my first cameras. It was Canon 1000D, which is almost the same camera as this one. And I was just really digging the image quality of the DSLR and the flexibility of having interchangeable lenses, which was a luxury back then when I was used to taking photos with a compact camera. And this was kind of the good stuff back in the days for the enthusiasts and the beginners back then. The alternative was basically a fixed lens camera, which couldn't really hold up anything against something like this. Now, if we're gonna get into the review of this camera, I'm actually gonna start with the things that I don't like about this camera, things that will make you realize how old it is, and the things that are limiting factors about this camera. The first thing being the dynamic range. The dynamic range of old cameras like this one is not particularly good. You will struggle with highlights and shadows, and contrasty images will be challenging to capture in a good way. It's been a while since I've actually been photographing, and in the meantime I've just been using my phone. And I was kind of surprised when taking this camera out today, seeing how simple contrasty situations just blew out the highlights and crushed the shadows compared to the dynamic range of my phone these days. And to think that this camera has worse dynamic range than a cell phone would be kind of unthinkable back in 2008, but that is the reality today. So you really have to know what you're doing in order to get the most out of this camera. The ISO performance of these cameras is not good. I would say it's only usable up to about 800 ISO. After 800 ISO, it just gets very grainy, and at 1600 ISO it just falls apart. So you have to use this camera at lower ISOs if you want to get any decent image quality. The autofocus system on this camera is not particularly good. It is slow, it's not very precise, and it only has 9 AF points, with the center point being cross type. That being said, if you use the center point and a good lens, you can get some decent autofocus on some moving subjects, but you will be very limited in this category. And if photographing moving stuff like animals and sports, this camera is absolutely not the right camera for you. The viewfinder is small. Now the eyepiece is missing on this one, but looking through this viewfinder, you can just see a tiny picture of what you're photographing. Now this is just inconvenient. It's just that a large viewfinder is more pleasing to look through. It doesn't do anything about the image quality. Obviously this camera doesn't have any weather sealing, but I have seen videos online of people basically dunking these with water and they are still functioning, so I wouldn't be worried about getting a few drops of water on it. And also, this being so cheap, I wouldn't worry about anything really. Obviously this camera has no video function, there is no live view function either, so you cannot use this camera to record any fancy videos. This is just for photos. But now over to the good stuff. The first good thing about this camera, I would say, is the screen. The screen is actually pretty big. It's more than big enough, and it's sharp enough as well. You can absolutely check if your images are in focus with zooming on the pictures when reviewing them. And the screen is just doing its job. It's not obviously not as sharp as modern day camera screens, but it's sharp enough and it's bright enough. So it's a good screen. This camera is very simple to operate. The Canon menus are simple to navigate, and selecting autofocus points is very simple. It's just easy to access all the functions on this camera, and that's one of the things that I like about it. When you got it in your fingers, it's just really easy to do all your adjustments on the fly to this camera. Now, even though this camera has some pretty poor dynamic range, I was amazed when I was looking through the images on Lightroom, which we will look at in a moment, when I saw just how much you can push these images when you're photographing in RAW format. So you can kind of mitigate some of the problems with the bad dynamic range on this camera, but just be aware that when you are pushing the highlights and the shadows, you will end up with some more noise and possibly some relatively ugly clipping highlights. This being a Canon EOS camera means that it's using these EF lenses, and with EF lenses you have a huge selection of lenses to choose from. Today I was only using this nifty 50, which is almost also basically free. It's a very cheap lens, f1.8 and 50mm. Can take some very pleasing images with it, and it's just so much flexibility with these lenses that you can throw on basically anything from the EOS, APS-C and full frame line. The last thing I want to mention about this camera is that the battery life is good. You're not wasting battery with live view, and you're not wasting battery with video functions. If you're just photographing it, a few batteries will last you all day. So that was the last point of my review of this camera. Now we're actually going to look at some of the images and I'll just talk about them a little bit. So just stay tuned. So I was outside today taking some photos of my dog and just taking a walk, doing some street photography, which is something I haven't been doing in ages. So just bear with me, but I think they turned out pretty nice. First thing I did here was do a small autofocus test of my dog. I just called her name and she came running to me. And you can see that the first image missed. Second image also missed, but not horribly. Third image, spot on the autofocus. Pretty impressive. And this is at f2.2. Third image, also spot on the autofocus. And the fourth image, also spot on the eyes. So this was pretty interesting and impressive for this camera, which is always talked about as having so poor autofocus. Now we're just going to look through some of the images. Just a cat laying around. Here you can see some of the challenges I had with the highlights and the shadows. These images are obviously edited in Lightroom, but I've done my best to save some of the highlights, which I couldn't, and to erase some of the shadows. Obviously I have tweaked the colors a little bit, but the color science, or whatever people call it these days, is pretty pleasing, I would say. The sharpness is nice. As you can see, the 12 megapixels offer plenty of resolution. And the limiting factor here is not the megapixels, it's rather the lens that I'm using. Overall, I would say that this camera produces very nice and pleasing images, and it's just as pleasing as it was back in 2008. Next picture. I was just impressed by how vibrant and nice I could make these colors appear in Lightroom out of the camera. And this is just quick, very, very quick editing. And it was a beautiful day outside, obviously, with a kind of a low sun. Here's one of the images where the low dynamic range was becoming apparent. As you can see, the shadow areas are just completely lost and the highlights are blown out. So this is where this camera struggles without doing HDR photos or something like that. Not as bad on this photo. but still it struggles with the dynamic range. Again, not as bad on this one, but the colors are nice, absolutely. Here you can see some clipping highlights. This actually appears pretty much like it was to look at. It was almost impossible to look at because it was so bright. But I would say that this was pretty nice. And yeah, the photo turned out okay. This one as well. Again, just impressed with how vibrant the colors are, considering that this is such an old camera. And the details are, even though it's just 12 megapixels, are still impressive, I would say. There is some noise, but it's just pleasant noise in this image. Most of these pictures were at ISO 100. Still nice colors. And there's nothing really holding me back technically about this camera in these situations. Here you can see some highlights more or less clipping out on the edge. But still, I would say this camera just renders everything very, very nicely. And I was kind of motivated by doing this short little walk with the camera. It was a nice, relaxing experience. It reminds me of the good old days, back in the old days. Just some cliche plant photos. Again, it is struggling slightly with the dynamic range, but nothing too bad here. And still nice, vibrant colors. And for the last image, just my dog looking out the window. Also, obviously, challenges with the dynamic range here, but still having a low dynamic range on this photo just, I would say, just increased the whole mood of the image, because the highlights are supposed to be blown out and the inside is supposed to be dark. So that's basically it for this review of the Canon 450D. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you like what I'm doing, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.